In the last lesson, we talked about the many meanings that the word strategy can have. In this lesson, we're going to talk about strategic situations. And as it turns out, a strategic situation can be relatively precisely defined. A strategic situation is a situation in which the outcomes for each player depend not only on what he or she does, but also what others do. Now think about that for a moment. A strategic situation is one in which you, no matter how good you are or how smart you are, what happens to you depends also on what others do. I used to live in the Boston area. On a nice weekend, when the weather's nice in the summertime, if you drive north from Boston, you can be on the beach in Maine in an hour or so. But when you start home later that day, it doesn't matter how fast your car is or how skillful you are as a driver, you're going to get caught in traffic with all the people who are coming back to Massachusetts, back to the Boston area from the beaches in Maine. Now, you do have something that you can do in that situation, even though how much traffic you get caught in depends on how many other people are deciding to return home at the same time. You can make some decisions that improve your situation. You could, for example, choose to leave early. You could leave during the best beach weather. The very best beach weather would be the most pleasant time to be on the beach, and most people will choose to stay on the beach during the very best beach weather. But that's the whole reason why you'll encounter less traffic as you come back to Boston. So you do have influence over strategic situations and the outcomes that you achieve in those situations, but you do not have complete influence. What happens to you also depends on what other people decide. That's a strategic situation. The definition that we're using for a strategic situation is the same as the definition for a game in game theory. We'll occasionally talk about games and game theory in this course, although this is not really a game theory course. To give you a sense of why this is important, we'll be talking about one of the most important and famous games in game theory, and one that represents a lot of strategic situations in business. It's called the prisoner's dilemma. So what's the story with the prisoner's dilemma? Well, let's consider the situation of Joe and Henry. Joe and Henry are bad guys. They're criminals. Together, they commit a crime, but they're not great criminals, so they get caught. Now, the police grab them. They put them each in a separate room, but the police realize they don't have enough evidence to convict them both for the most serious crime that they believe Joe and Henry committed. So they put them in separate rooms and they offer each of them the same deal. The deal they're going to try to use to get Joe and Henry to confess. Maybe you've seen this on television shows or something like this, but this is how the deal goes. This is the deal that they offer separately to both Joe and Henry. First, they say, if you confess and your partner doesn't, we'll let you off with just a 1-year prison term because you've been so cooperative. Second, if he confesses and you don't, we're going to throw the book at you. You're going to get a severe prison sentence of 8 years because you haven't been cooperative and he has been. Now, as it turns out, you're a pretty seasoned criminal, and you know that if neither of you confesses, they're not going to be able to pin the biggest crime on you, but they probably will be able to pin something more minor, and you'll probably both end up getting about 3 years in prison. You also know that if both of you confess, you won't get the book thrown at you. You won't get the full 8-year sentence, but if both of you confess, you'll probably end up with about 5 years in jail, both of you. So that's the situation. Those are the penalties. That's the deal that you're facing. What are you going to do? So what did you decide? To help us analyze this situation, we can put the penalties and the choices into a table that looks something like this. Now, if you're Henry, let's just take the situation from Henry's perspective. You're going to ask yourself what you would like to do if Joe doesn't confess. Well, if Joe doesn't confess, then you would prefer 1 year in prison to 3 years in prison, so you're going to confess. If Joe does confess, then you prefer 5 years in prison to 8 years in prison, so you'll confess. So no matter what Joe does, you prefer to confess. Now, unfortunately, exactly the same thing is true for Joe. No matter what you do, he prefers to confess. And what that means is if you're both rational actors, you will both confess. and you'll both end up getting 5 years in prison. This is an example of what's called a dominating strategy. It is a strategy that is the best choice for you, that pays higher rewards or lower penalties, no matter what the other person does. That's said to be a dominating strategy. Not all games, not all strategic situations have dominating strategies, but in the prisoner's dilemma, confess is a dominating strategy. Why? Because if Joe confesses, Henry's better off confessing. And if Joe doesn't confess, Henry is still better off confessing. And vice versa for Joe. No matter what the other does, you get a lower prison sentence if you confess. So both of you confess, and that's that. You end up with 5 years in prison. By doing what is best for each of you individually, you end up in a situation that neither one of you likes very much. The police have, of course, set it up this way. They've been very clever, and what they're going to achieve, or what they hope to achieve, is that both of you will confess, and you'll both end up doing at least 5 years. The ranking of the outcomes for Joe and Henry, well, they'd both like it best if, say, you confess and the other person doesn't, because that gets you off light. If neither person confesses, then you both get only 3 years, which is better than 5 years. We both confess, we end up with 5 years prison for both of you, and if he confesses but I do not, well, that's the very worst. So the equilibrium situation is the third ranked choice for each player. Now, what does that have to do with business? Well, that's a story about two prisoners in jail, but it turns out that businesses face situations like this all the time. Let's consider the situation of two candy companies competing in the same market. Suppose at first they price their candy bars at just about the same level, and each of them has a certain market share. One day, however, the price of a commodity, say sugar, decreases, and so both companies face a decision about whether to reduce the prices of their candy bars. What should they do? Well, we can express this situation in a table, just like the situation that represented the prisoner's dilemma. Company A can keep the current pricing or drop prices. Company B has the same choices. If you work your way through this situation as well, you'll find that the equilibrium is that both companies will drop their prices and both will end up with lower profits than they had before. Take a look at this matrix and convince yourself that that's the case. Are there different outcomes that are possible in real life if you're two candy companies and you're having this problem? Well, one thing you could do is, if you're the CEO of one candy company, you could call up the CEO of the other candy company and say, how about if we don't reduce our prices? How about if we agree not to reduce our prices? There's one problem with that. That's mostly illegal in most places because it's considered bad for consumers. Lower prices are good for consumers. That's called collusion. And in most situations, that's illegal. Another way that it can unfold, that is legal, is if both companies have a track record of these kinds of situations and had developed a set of practices, a way of implicitly cooperating. In other words, it may be well understood that last time sugar prices dropped, neither of us dropped our prices. And so we can read an implicit assumption into this situation that neither of us will drop our prices. This is an example of what's called a repeated game or a repeated strategic situation. And the strategies for repeated situations can be different than the strategies for one-time plays. Robert Axelrod, a political science researcher, has shown that one of the simplest strategies is the best strategy in a repeated game. It's called tit for tat. And tit for tat means you start by cooperating, and then after that, you mimic whatever the other player did last time. That's a surprisingly simple strategy that outperforms many, many more sophisticated strategies in strategic situations. Okay, so games like this reside in the background of many strategy situations, but in real life, things are more complicated. There are more players, people may not behave rationally. This matters in determining outcomes. That's a strategic situation. As you can see, we can define that fairly cleanly, and we're going to return to many strategic situations in the course. Now we're going to pause for a quiz about strategic situations.